So yeah, it's pretty great to be here. I didn't really know what to expect, but there's a lot of very eager faces here. So pretty excited to share a little bit about recruiting, some stuff that I've come to learn along the way. But recruiting, like most things in business, there's nothing unique I can share. It's just like a lot of perspective, just my personal theories around it. So I want to make sure this is more engaging. So feel free to stop and ask any questions. If you think some of the theories are a little off, or if you've seen something else work, I'd love to hear. This is something that I'm continuously refining myself from having seen how a lot of different companies, early stage companies, larger companies have done recruiting. Something that we've implemented at Trustwork as well. This notion of value-based recruiting. So we'll get into some of the details there, but as you go through it, if you have any questions, don't feel like you have to wait till the very end to ask questions. Please just stop me and keep asking me questions. So let's see. So a quick outline of what I'm hoping to cover. Why is hiring important? Some pieces of hiring. What are the different pieces? How do you think about it? Then we get into the pieces, starting with, I would imagine, like the easiest parts around closing and onboarding. That might sound a little counterintuitive, but the whole theory is if you do recruiting well, closing shouldn't be that hard. And how do you vet candidates? And then last, how do you source the best talent, which is probably like the centerpiece of a lot of what I want to share. Why is hiring important? If you ask most founders, like what matters, you might think it is like the idea or the tech you're building or how cool the product is. But in reality, you're in the business of people, right? People are your biggest cost. You're not going to be able to control big parts of your business. So what you're going to be forced to do fairly early on in the whole process is finding the right people who can take care of the company that you're building. So people don't realize this, but even if you talk to Fortune 500 CEOs, one of the top things that they worry about is hiring the best people. Hiring people isn't hard, but hiring the best people and retaining them is incredibly hard. Retaining people is also pretty hard, right? But if you hire the right people, retaining them over a long period of time is not too hard. And that's something that we see at Trustwork. We've been around for 2 years. We haven't lost that many people. Whereas if you talk to a lot of startups, you hear about churn, and it's a revolving door, and it's really hard to keep people engaged for a long period of time, especially if you expect them to work really long hours, not get paid that much, and sacrifice a lot from a personal standpoint. Like, how do you keep them doing that for 5 years, 10 years? And that's like a big ask, right? But if you're able to do that from the very beginning, from like the sourcing piece, that whole process becomes a lot easier. So if you talk to a lot of people around, what keeps you up at night? If you ask like any CEO, CTO, COO, like what keeps you up at night? Typically, one of the pieces would be around talent and how do I go after the best talent. I know this because Piazza. I don't know if you guys have used Piazza in your classroom. I see a few of you guys have. So Piazza, for those who haven't used, it's a class discussion forum where you can ask questions online, and you can tap into your class network to help answer those questions. Your professors can jump in, your TAs can jump in. We wanted to keep that product free because we didn't want to monetize an education platform. We didn't want professors to not use Piazza because it was too expensive for them. So we got creative. We built this college recruiting platform that could generate the revenue needed to keep supporting this classroom education tool. And in that process, we got to talk to a lot of different companies about their recruiting process and what they care about. And Piazza's main value add that we ended up selling was this ability to search and target and communicate with the people that closely match their heuristics. So we'll get into that piece in a little bit. So I wanted to just quickly highlight all the different pieces that goes into hiring. These pieces are the same whether you're trying to find your co-founder, if you're trying to find your 1,000th employee, right? The way you focus on different parts of it might change. When you're doing something at scale, the problem's a little different from, say, finding a co-founder, right? Like you're just finding like one person. But the pieces that goes into that are the same, right? Sourcing, vetting, closing, and onboarding. Onboarding, you'll be like, hey, does that actually fit in recruiting? No, it really does, right? Like, there's no point doing all this work if you don't effectively onboard someone, because then they're not going to stick around. You might think, oh, they might stick around for a few months and leave, but typically they would stick around for like a few weeks, maybe a month, and they don't really buy into what you're doing, and they're going to bounce. My theory, I would say most companies end up focusing very heavily on vetting, and they think a lot about the process of what is the interview number one, what's interview number two, what sort of engineering challenges should I give, how do I test their skills, right? So a lot of companies focus on that, mostly because it's a very time-intensive process, right? If you think about, okay, I'm going to spend 30 minutes on this screening call, then like an hour on this step, and an hour on that step, and if you add it up, it's about 4 or 5 hours on a candidate, and then if you're interviewing, like, say, hundreds of candidates, that could add up, so people end up trying to optimize on that a lot. The part that a lot of people end up missing is the sourcing component. So I would say at Trustwork, we exclusively focus on sourcing, on making sure we're fishing in the ponds where there are fish that we want to, we want to catch. So, which means that our funnels typically doesn't have like hundreds of candidates. We might have maybe 5, maybe 10 people that we talk to, but those would be typically like the people that we would want to hire just from, on paper. So when you think about the process, you have to think about, what are some of the challenges in hiring, right? Like, it does take a good amount of time to find the right person and convince them to join you, but also there's a lot of cost in hiring the wrong person, right? The wrong person is you're going to entrust a part of your business, whether it's big or small, with this person, right? Hiring the wrong person is going to take away a lot of your, business value. They're going to impact the culture in a big way, right? Your company culture, people think of culture as like, oh, I go on retreats, or I do this party, or I do this like fun activities, but in reality, culture is just an addition of all your people. So even like one bad actor in that mix could really impact your culture. And the other part that a lot of companies have started talking about now is this notion of cross-competent bonds, meaning you might have hired a person who's really bad, right? Like not a very good engineer, not a good culture fit, but that person could become the best friend with your top player, like your co-founder, right? Now, once you form that bond, and if you end up parting ways with this person, it usually becomes like a 2-for-1 deal or 3-for-1 deal. Like you end up losing everyone who is friends with that person. So that's something I've seen a lot. I initially thought, that doesn't really work that well. But yeah, people get emotionally invested in other people. And when you lose one person, that is going to have a ripple effect on others, even though it might not logically make sense. That could happen. And then obviously, if you hire someone and they leave, you would have, when you hire that person, you're going to start planning around that person being around. And if that person leaves, that's going to add a lot of strain to everyone else in the organization. This is particularly true when you're a 2-person, 3-person, 4-person company, because you might have taken on a lot, or rather you might be forced to take on a lot given what you're trying to accomplish. And every person you lose means you're going to now hire someone else, you're going to train someone else. It takes a lot out if you don't get recruiting correct. So that's why we are, it's very painful to go through like a really good recruiting process, but at the end, the person you ended up with is a great fit, is going to be around for a long time, and is going to add a massive amount of value over a long period of time. Because typically people start adding good value within like 6 months, right? And then their last 6 months in a company is usually, again, they're dragging their feet. So if you say that average time someone spends in a company is like 2 years, you're really getting like 1 year's worth of real work from them. So the longer you can invest and keep someone engaged in what you're doing, the exponential amount of value you can extract from what they do. Yeah, so there is some stuff you can do, right? That's why I think onboarding is pretty important, right? If you say, if I don't do anything, this is the timeline it's going to take, then you say, okay, how do I speed this up a little bit? A lot of it is around, we'll get into that in a little bit, but most of it is around like setting realistic goals and how do you measure if they can rise up. But the problem is, there is even your best employee, even in that best scenario, there are going to be certain things that's going to prevent them from hitting very measurable value, right? So you're going to have to bet on them, and we do this a lot at Trustwork as well, is that you have to really back them, right? You cannot be second guessing them along the way in their first like 2-3 months, and they're going to be second guessing themselves. And this is especially true in an early company. You're going to have to say, okay, I've put all this thought in finding this person, so I'm going to trust that they're going to be able to produce the value that I've pegged them on, right? And if you're not able to do that, then you shouldn't hire that person, right? Like a lot of problems are solved if you simply don't hire someone. If you think they're risky, then you shouldn't. And I'll get into how do you get some of those markers, right? If your recruiting process is good, you can. If your recruiting process is like great, you find those problems at the very first step, right? If it's not that great, you would eventually find it. If it's bad, you don't find it at all, and it's like totally surprising when someone turns out to be unethical or they're not working hard. It could happen. I mean, keep in mind, I've also experienced, even if you have like a good recruiting process, people can say the right things and kind of get through the door. That's unavoidable, but like you have to hope that that is the minority scenario, and in the majority cases, you're able to catch some of these red flags and stop investing in that process even further. Cool. So let's get started on closing and onboarding. I say this is the easiest piece because if you are able to find the right person, you've vetted out if they're very good at what you want them to do, and if you like mixed in enough pitching along the way, by the time it comes to closing, they should be completely bought into what you're doing, right? And this is not just around the mission, it's also around compensation, right? You don't want to come to the end of the process and someone says, I'm not going to join if you don't pay me $200,000. Sure. So based on the company, where the company is in its journey, your inbound is going to be different, right? So say if you're Facebook doesn't have any problem, or Google, I guess now Facebook might have some problem, but like, let's say Google might not have any problem getting like a lot of people to apply, right? So, but a small company would have a ton of problem getting any inbound, because no one's heard of you, like, like maybe even if they've heard of you, like you haven't really articulated what you do in a public forum in a great way. Like I would say Trustwork falls in that bucket. We try to do so many things, it's very hard to articulate exactly what we do. So even someone coming to your website might be a little confused. So on the sourcing side, you're going to have to do a lot of things that are proactive than reactive. So so Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all these companies work with Piazza, for example, and we're like, wait, why would you pay hundreds of thousands of dollars when all these people are coming to you? They want to be able to actually like search and find people based on certain heuristics, right? So for example, they would want to find top students, or maybe the role is for like machine learning. They would want to find like the best machine learning kids at UT and like Stanford or whatever, a bunch of schools, whereas their system of like getting applicants in might not be that robust. And typically, a lot of these big companies say there's like a inverse correlation. So if someone's like applying a ton, that might be, they might be having a harder time finding jobs, whereas like sometimes like the best of the best are not really applying. They're like in a dorm room, just like doing their thing. But given that they're good, like they don't have that much challenges like finding work. So how do you like get to that person, right? And that problem is actually true even for a small company, right? Like some of the best talent is not putting themselves out there as much as you would want them to. So how do you first break into them, as in like how do you get them talking to you, and then how do you communicate your value? Is on the sourcing side we'll talk a lot about how do you target really well. But then to your point though, I would say every company, big or small, should keep thinking about the luck surface. Like how do you increase that luck surface of you finding that great hire, right? It might be, everyone might have to do a lot of things. Maybe post on LinkedIn, maybe post on AngelList, have a Glassdoor profile. Like you might have to do all of these things, but most of those things might not translate into hires, right? So a lot of your hiring might have to be very, very proactive. And if you're looking to build like an early stage company, even if it's like a 10, 15, 20-person company, you're still, I mean, Trustwork is at like 80 people. We're still doing very like proactive sourcing to find people. So yeah, going back to closing, if you're able to like put in a lot of different pieces in your interview process, closing is mostly a discussion of saying, okay, here are the numbers, here's a piece of paper, sign it, right? Like in my experience, I haven't seen this taken more than like a day or two, if we're able to get them to that point. So what ends up mattering, right? So one is going to be, you have to really emphasize on what they wanted, right? If they came to your company, why did they come to your company? Was it your mission, or was it like the interesting problems you solved? Was it the people? Was it the pay? Was it the location? And there are going to be so many different reasons why someone was attracted to what you were doing or what your company was doing. How do you keep communicating more of that and communicate the offer in that context, right? Because if you're a small company, you're never going to be able to articulate the offer in the context of money, because someone else is always going to pay more than you, right? So, or if you say like, I'll give you a ton of equity, like your equity is in reality worth like $0. So like, you need to find something that people can latch onto. And typically people leave companies not because they had one thing they didn't like, they typically have like 3 or 4 things that they didn't like, right? So if you're able to communicate that from the start when they bring them in, that's something you can keep reinforcing as you think about them staying in your company, right? Yeah, so one of the things that we did early in our days was we just had a apartment that we rented, and we told them, hey, you can stay here for free. We'll have meals for free, right? So basically thinking through it, especially, I mean, the free case is obviously very, very hard. And typically if you're a college kid, your burn is also very, very low, right? So you have to figure out, okay, if the burn is low, like what are the things that would even cause a non-zero amount of burn? And how can a company kind of get rid of that as much as possible, right? So based on the stage of the company, there might be some perks that would be like more interesting than others, right? Like I think room and board is a big one. We still have, like in Austin, we have an apartment which houses like 3 guys, and that enables them to take a salary like half or a third of what they would have gotten out there, because from their point of view, right, like they're not coming here to get rich on salary, right? If you're going to build a company in general, this is something that I have to talk through a lot of candidates, right? You're coming to a startup, yeah, to build something, the technical challenges, but yeah, there is a portion of wanting to be financially, it has to be financially lucrative. But people come in knowing that the salary is not going to make them rich. It's building equity in something that's going to make them really rich, right? So I've had people be like, hey, can I take even lower salary and get more equity? Like that's the kind of candidate that ends up succeeding in Trustwork, for example. But you should be able. But at the same time, people have real financial needs, right? Some people might have to pay back student loans. Some people might have certain things that prevents them from taking big financial risks, especially in an early stage company. For those people, sometimes they might not be a good fit, right? Like say if someone's like, hey man, I want to pay for my house and pay for my kids like college and this, that, and the other, and because of that I need like $200,000. It might be true. Maybe that person does need $200,000, but that also means that they might not be a perfect fit for the stage that we are at, and they might be better for a different company. So The toughest thing, for me personally, is trying to go through and see like what are the motivations to want to be in a startup, right? A lot of people want to be in a startup, especially today, right? Now that there are movies and TV shows and there are all these like success stories, like everyone wants to say like, I'm an entrepreneur. I mean, I moved here from Silicon Valley, and in Silicon Valley, people kind of laugh at you if you work at like a Google or a Facebook or some big company, because it's pretty sexy being an entrepreneur, right? But you can't really get into it if someone's like, yeah, I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to build this company, but these are my non-negotiable things. Like, I'm inflexible, but I want to be an entrepreneur. That usually means it's like a misfit in terms of expectations. So that's why I'm saying all of those you should have like figured out and weeded out before it even comes to closing. So when it comes to closing, it's mostly very marginal differences, right? It might be like like 50K versus like 53K, or like 50K and I need like help relocating my stuff. It'll like very marginal things you talk through, because a lot of people think of like closing as a negotiation, right? But that's something I hate, because at the end of the day, if that person says yes, you're going to be working with them, right? So you don't want to feel like I won or he won. You want it to be a partnership. So you want to say, okay, look, I want to give you as much as I can. Like, what do you really need? And if you're able to come up with an agreement, then you should make it work, even if it's like a little uncomfortable on both ends. So communicating that early on, but also in the closing conversation, ends up making that process a little smoother. One piece that I started like really dig into recently is the other influences in their lives, right? And this is particularly true for early stage startups, because everyone, like if you're like, hey, I want to work at a startup, and I've experienced this myself, everyone around you, your friends, your parents, everyone's going to be like, don't do it. Are you dumb? Especially if you have like a counter offer like Amazon or Google or whatever, right? Everyone's going to be like, yo, what's wrong with you? Like, don't do it. So each person is going to have a bunch of things that influences them, and you want to engage them in the conversation, right? So one question I ask, especially like senior people, is, okay, like who all do you talk to when you're going to make this decision, right? They'll be like, well, typically like my wife or my husband or whatever, and I'll ask them, what would they want for you, right? Like, what would your significant other want for your career? And if they say, well, I mean, my wife wants me to like have like a high-paying job and like stay at home as much as possible, then there's going to be some sort of a misfit. Then you want to say, okay, is that actually like the scenario, or is it something particular that made them feel that way? So recently, I had a senior engineer who had been at startups, kind of got screwed a couple of times. His equity went to zero. So his wife is like, hey, go back to Apple. Like we don't do the startup thing again. So me and my wife, we took both of them out to dinner. We talked about her concerns, and we were able to pinpoint what was actually the problem for her with startups, and be able to like articulate why my company would be a little different, right? At Piazza, I remember early on when we built Piazza, it was built by college interns, and a lot of them, we wanted them to like take time off from school and work with us. And obviously the parents are like, they were not happy at all. So me and my CEO, we flew to Chicago one time to talk to this engineer's parents to let him like take some time off and work on this. So yeah, like so you might find people who are like all in a mission, down to work for whatever the pay that you can afford, all of that, but they might have like one or two people in their lives that say, no, I don't think this is a good idea. And that could completely derail all of this work that you put in. So bringing them into the conversation ends up actually strengthening that, right? So if you think about the opposite side of that, if the person's network is bought into what they're doing, even if that person is feeling down, and they're going to feel down a lot, if they're especially working in like a smaller company, they are going to help them see the better picture and sort of prop them up a little bit to keep going whenever they feel like they want to quit. Then there are small things that you can do to make them feel special, and that's something I would say smaller companies can do a better job at than bigger companies, right? If you're hiring like 500 people a year, you might not be able to do something that's like very unique. So say you're talking to me and you like Frisbee, right? Like giving you a little Trustwork branded Frisbee for you might be like, oh man, that's like so thoughtful, that's so unique. And that kind of ties into the whole feel of like family and like the small team and how do you do more of that. Like I remember at Piazza, there were some more senior candidates who were getting offers that were like 2-3 times as much as what we were giving them. So we had to really sell the whole family aspect of it. There's a family, you can, so we would send them like a little gift every week. Like every day we'll go like drop something off, like a bottle of wine, a t-shirt, flowers, like whatever got them to say yes. At the end of the day, people are not as motivated by money as you might think. They're motivated by the team and the problem they're solving. And then the team piece, I think it could kind of be missed if you think of recruiting as this very process-driven thing where you say, okay, this step 1, this step 2, this step 3, and then offer. Here's, you email an offer and hope that they're gonna sign. It doesn't work that way, right? Even after you send an offer, I typically call them like every single day to check in, to be like, hey, do you have any questions? Oh, okay. Let me grab lunch with you. Can I get dinner with you? Like the more you sell like your team and your vision, that's going to get them even closer to signing. And when you're young, when you're a small company, it only takes one, right? You're looking for maybe one person, 2 people. You're not looking for hundreds of people. So you don't have to worry so much about having a process that is very scalable. You just want to find a process that converts well. Meaning if you find this superstar, what all can you do to make this person say yes? And then how do you put that into your process so that it gets them closer to saying yes when you come to closing time? Yeah, onboarding. So as I was saying earlier, onboarding is like a big piece of all of this. It's pretty important to involve your team. I empower them to be able to come up with a plan because you're not going to be able to like onboard every single person. Having clear goals help, right? So saying, hey, this is what a win looks like in 30 days. This is what a win looks like in 60, 90 days. And hopefully after that, you don't have to worry about that person. They're on autopilot. They're moving pretty fast. I spend, I would say, a majority of my time just talking about the vision and strategy. Especially if your company has like complex strategy or vision, there are a lot of moving parts. Or if it's just like early in its thought process, you might not be able to say, hey, this is what we do, one conversation and done. You have to keep talking to them about strategy. Like tactics change all the time. Plans change all the time, so there's no point communicating that too much. But strategy shouldn't change too much, right? It could, but it shouldn't change too much. So you should really enforce that into this early teammate so that you can make them independent and run on their own faster. And then obviously the teaming part, I talked about, how do you involve, get them into your family, incorporate them into the family, get them getting coffee with people, getting them knowing everyone, because at the end of the day, yes, you are, bullish about the mission or whatever, but you're going to stay because of the team and you like working with this team. So you want them to get to know the team in a more social setting than just a pure professional setting. This is more applicable to smaller teams than bigger teams. Bigger teams, you're more like a number, but and you might have like a team that might do this inherently. But smaller teams, you might have to kind of force yourself to go out there and organize events, or it doesn't have to be expensive things, but just like making sure you incorporate them into what you're working on. All right, so the vetting process. So what are some of the things that we think about when it comes to vetting, right? Vetting could be anywhere from like one conversation and you give an offer to like having like 15 different steps and giving an offer and still not working out. One conversation might yield in a good candidate, 15 conversations might still yield in a bad candidate. So it's not about steps. There might be a sweet spot based on your company and what you do and your team makeup and all of that. But the bigger thing to understand is like, hey, what matters? How do I think about setting this up, right? So the first piece is around, what are you trying to vet at each step? Most recruiting processes end up being like a popularity contest, right? Like, hey, do I like this person or not? And each person is more or less, each person in the recruiting like process is making that same decision. Like, I talked to this guy, like, can I get a beer with him? Like, you're mostly trying to figure out, do I like this person as a person or not? But you should think about what exactly are we getting at each piece of the stages, and then is that adding to this bigger picture or like this data set of this person where we decide if we want to hire him or not, right? So being very conscious about that makes setting up the process more robust. And obviously, you're going to have to sort of readjust if certain steps didn't. So say you had a screening call, and then you had like a technical interview, and like you see everyone's passing through the technical interview, maybe that wasn't a good step. Maybe you had to either get rid of that step, or you had to make that step tougher. You had to evaluate the pass through in each of those steps. But I'm saying something that's very quantitative, but you can kind of get a sense for it when you're like, wait a minute, like I'm talking to every single person that guy talked to. This doesn't seem like there is any sort of filtering. So how do we keep improving it? It's something you'll have to think through. Then yeah, like is it a technical screening or is it like a culture screening, right? Like I think there is like a mixture of both in any one of the steps, right? Especially on the culture piece, even technical interviews might have like a small cultural component of like, oh, is this guy fast moving or whatever? But if you try to do too much in one step, you might not get any value out of that step. So being conscious means, okay, if I'm going to vet culture, what exactly am I trying to get out of that conversation? Am I trying to see if he's fast, or am I trying to see if he's like has grit? Like what part am I focusing on? You have to think through that a little bit. Are you mixing selling and anti-pitching? So I know most companies actually incorporate heavy selling. I know at Trustwork, early days especially, we incorporated a lot of anti-pitching. Anti-pitching is like telling them, hey, this job is like really hard. Like this work hours are like insane. We just like try to scare them as much as possible, and then they still come back and say, yeah, I still want to be part of this. Then that's a good sign, right? But now the problem is we also noticed we were mostly anti-pitching. So by the time someone comes to like towards the end of the process, they were pretty clear how bad this could go, but they had like no idea of the upsides of how fun this could be. So it's important to kind of mix both of those in there. But like a lot of people don't have enough anti-pitching. They just try to ask a couple of questions, like typically like gotcha kind of questions, and then use that as a metric to like reject someone, right? So like if someone asks like, hey, is family important to you? And they're like, yes, family is important. Then they think, oh man, this guy needs like work-life balance, so that might be a bad fit, and then like would silently reject people instead of sort of giving them an accurate picture of what happens at your company and saying, are they able to, given that, are they still want to be working with you? So we do a better mix of anti-pitching now. And then yeah, do you have enough of like a outsider perspective? This goes into like diverse hiring, right? Like are you focused too much with the same kind of people that this person might pass through if they have fit a very narrow profile, but if they are slightly off that profile, they're going to pass, right? So how can you bring in different parts of the company to vet this person, even if it's as simple as like getting lunch with them in a team environment, right? And that also kind of goes into like bias. Like, are we? This is like a tough one to figure out in a startup kind of environment, especially since your numbers are very, very small, right? So it's hard to figure out, but you can kind of get a sense for bias if it's if you're too bro-y, or that alienates people. You can think about that a little bit, but it's important to make sure you're not actively trying to exclude a certain group of people from your company. All right, so this is kind of how we've set up our process. It's based on a book. It's called The Who Method of Hiring. It's one of the more popular books when it comes to like hiring methods. There are many others. The Who method of hiring is most companies use it for executive hiring, right? So a lot of companies end up spending a disproportionate amount of time hiring executives. But I would say if you're an early stage company, every single person is more or less as important as an executive in your company. So we try to incorporate parts of that, and we've started thinking, how do you streamline some of it? Because some parts of this could be very tactically intensive. So the first step is what we call a bar raiser, right? So say if I'm a hiring manager, I'm looking for engineers, I'm gonna, and if it's like a early stage company, I'm already very desperate, right? I need this engineer through the door, starting tomorrow. So I'm gonna subconsciously look at a person and be like, oh, this guy's good enough, right? I'm gonna want to interview this person. So what a bar raiser does, typically outside of the organization, would look at the candidate's profile and say should we even spend time talking to this person, right? Because that's the best way to save a lot of time, is saying okay, I don't think this person meets these heuristics. I don't know if those work out. Then it doesn't mean it's an automatic fail. It's you have a discussion, and that helps you as a hiring manager think through your values. Why would you push for this person, right? Sometimes it'll be say for example we have a heuristic. We'll get into that a little bit later as well. But a heuristic would be an A+ player, right? And that might be worked at a top company or went to a top 10 school or something like that, right? But we'll see someone who was a D1 player, maybe not a top tier school or whatnot, but you see that person's going to really be competitive and be really good. So we try to have a discussion and figure out, should we push them forward or not? And we typically end up failing a lot of people in the bar raiser level. Then the screening call is fairly quick, 20, 30 minutes, mostly to understand their background, right? One philosophy that we have is that past excellence is the best predictor of future performance, right? So if someone comes in who already crushed it, you're okay, they're probably going to crush it, right? But if someone has a fairly questionable background, then you're taking a risk in saying this person is going to come in and crush it, right? So we're mostly asking questions like, hey, what are your goals? Career goals, obviously, but then what are you really good at? What are you bad at? How would your past employers rate you? I mean, that's a big question for me. If someone comes in and says oh, my past employer would give me a 6, or a 7. And then you ask, okay, what about the one before that? Yeah, that's a 6 or a 7. And I was oh, it's a 6. And then you're okay, this person clearly doesn't have a track record of excellence, right? But if someone says 8 or 9 or 10, some people tend to be biased towards lower numbers. So some people might consistently say 8. Then you're okay, I mean, this person's max is 8 because they fundamentally think 9 or 10 is only for perfection or whatever. So screening calls, typically if something passes bar raiser, screening calls wouldn't catch too much. Then goes into the focus interviews. The focus interviews could be different for engineering, operations, a business, marketing. It could be different. That I think most people can figure it out. It's some sort of combination of a low fidelity test, an algorithm test if you're an engineer, or something more involved, a longer, a 2-hour technical interview, right, to see your rigor. And then once you have all of this, we do another bar raiser, right? So someone unbiased can look at all this information we've gathered from the screening and all the focus interviews and say, hey, does this person seem right? If you're an early stage company, typically our bar raisers will be a board member or an advisor, someone who looks at it and says is this, yeah, I believe it. This guy's pretty good, right? And then the last one is our most intensive step, the career deep dive. That end up taking 2 to 3 hours. So that's more than all of our other steps combined. So that's why we try to do a bar raiser before that to make sure, yeah, we do want to move forward with this person. That career deep dive, again, is described in the book, The Who Method, but it goes into details of who are your top 3 influences? Okay, this job, who was your manager? Who was your peer? What would they give you? Why would they give you this score? It goes into very in-depth, and that unlocks a lot of skeletons in your closet, right? And typically, if you've done everything correctly, like it shouldn't uncover anything that you haven't seen. So that's why we save it to be like, that is like a gut check. Like we think we could have hired this person in the focus interview step itself, but the career deep dive lets us like really double check before we make this massive investment to make sure everything checks out. And part of that interview is, we'll ask, hey, who's your manager? Oh, Dave? Okay. What would Dave give you on a scale of 1 to 10? We're like, okay, a 9. Okay, why not a 10? And they'll like, share. Well, he might say that I'm not on time to meetings or whatever, right? And then we go through that with like a lot of different jobs and different people, and then we say, hey, can I talk to Dave? Can I talk to Sam? We pick a few people where we think could give interesting references on that person, right? Like typically when you say like, hey, give me your references, they're going to pick the people who are going to be like, this guy's the best dude in the world, right? But we want to be able to pick the people who are going to give him like great reviews, but also it could be sort of dicey reviews. And then when we call them, we ask them like, hey, talk to Dave. Dave said you really liked him, but he also mentioned that he doesn't show up to meetings on time, right? So in a typical reference call, I've done a lot of them. Typically, it was like, oh, he was pretty good. Yeah, he worked pretty well. But once you like disarm them a little bit, they'll be like, oh yeah, that guy just couldn't show up to things on time. He was like such a pain in the ass. And they'll get into that and I'll be like, oh man, like good thing we caught this early, right? So reference check is something I would say most companies end up skipping, but we are like super rigorous about checking reference even before like going to the offer stage. Sometimes we might skip some steps here and there, but typically like it's offer is pending, reference is coming back positive. All right, so sourcing. So as I said, sourcing is like a big piece of what we do. And all of that starts from like the heuristics, how do we, who are we looking for, right? How do you characterize them? What are the traits you would really need? What traits are nice to have? For example, engineer, we want someone who is very, very good at engineering, but it is also entrepreneurial, right? Like what does entrepreneurial mean? Maybe they started a company, maybe they worked at an early stage company, like you would write down what your heuristic really matter, right? And then you have to stick to it, right? Like recruiting is kind of like working out, or it's like dating, right? You kind of know what the right thing to do is. You just try to take shortcuts. So for us, heuristics is something that we try to map and obviously update as needed, but we try to be true to it. We try not to take like too many shortcuts around it. Improving discoverability, we talked about this a little bit, how can you be in a lot of different places so that if someone does run into you, they have enough information. And then involving the entire team, that kind of starts getting into some of the proactive stuff, right? Like if people are not automatically applying towards you, so how do you get to them? One big part of it is your network, right? Like typically you can get your network. If you ask your network, they're going to help you find someone. And if they come through your network, it's very easy to like vet them out, right? So we do this when someone new joins. We download their LinkedIn. You can export their contacts or whatever, and then we send an email to their contacts as like an update, right? And it's like, hey, I found this new job, blah, blah, blah. Trustwork does this. Here are some of the openings that we have. And I've gotten so many responses and we do this every like few months because there's always something new in your company to update your network on. And that gets a lot of response like, oh, I didn't realize. Oh, that's pretty cool, man. I'm actually looking for a job. We should talk, right? So that starts creating a little bit of that. So I spend a lot of time thinking of creative ways to get in front of people. One thing that we can do on scale that we rely on a lot today is, we go on something like LinkedIn. I mean, LinkedIn, the way they make money is through their recruiting tools, right? But it's like extremely expensive. So what I do is I just get like LinkedIn Premium or something like that, or even like the base search. We search for people that meet some of our heuristics. So recently we've been looking for like a general manager kind of role. So we wanted people who either played a D1 sport or was in the Marines or Army, went to like business school, and did like consulting or something like that, right? So like very, very specific things which you can put into like a search, And then we find people, then we like put all those people into like a spreadsheet, use like some tools to find their email addresses, like Constant Contact is one of them that we use, and then do like a multi-touch email campaign we use a thing called Yesware. These might be just too much details, but a way for us to find the people that we want to talk to, and then what does it take to get them to talk to us is usually just keep pinging them a few times, right? Like what I'm describing is not unique. It's done in sales a lot. Like that's how enterprise sales work. But the same principle could apply in recruiting as well. You know this universe of people you want to talk to. How do you get creative and like pinging them, right? Obviously, there's a lot of sourcing tools out there. Piazza is there, AngelList is there, Hire. There are a lot of tools. How do you creatively use them is something that we think about. We're constantly thinking about like what are different ways we can get people to come talk to us, right? Whether it's like hosting a hackathon or doing this event or that event. Like we have an event called Disrupt Tech that we've had like a bunch of UT kids come to, where we talk about risky topics in tech, right? Around ethical things, around Facebook stuff or like scooters. How do you get people to come talk to you, and in that process sort of share more about what you're up to? Yeah. So in sourcing, there's no like silver bullet. There are some tools that kind of gets you far, but they're pretty expensive. In a smaller company, you might not be able to afford a lot of it. So you have to get like really creative in tapping into all the different avenues and getting in front of people. So I had a couple of example scenarios here. I kind of walked through it, but for engineering hiring, we say under top school or top company, we don't hire, like that's something that we kind of fudge a lot because we find really good talent from everywhere. But has done something exceptional, right? We should like be able to look at this guy and be like, okay, this guy like crushed this one thing. That makes it like pretty special. Like a lot of our early teammates have won like national championships or like played professional sports or like did something incredible that makes them like an A+ player. And then like are they hardworking, right? Like again, like I know sports kind of goes into a lot. We end up hiring a lot of athlete types, or musician types, military types, or are they entrepreneurial, right? These are things that we look for. Engineering. This kind of we can probably skip over this. It's just like how do you structure the focus interviews to see if they're fundamentally strong, are they good problem solvers, and I'm just glancing through this because I know we're kind of running out of time. But then for business development, same thing. A lot of similar markers, but then we had to tailor it a little bit for biz dev. So like the GM kind of roles, and this is kind of how we do like some of the vetting. I mean, these are very tactical stuff. You guys would have access to this deck anyways. So I want to stop there and make sure I have time to answer any questions you guys have. Yeah, so, and as I said, it's just communicating what you do. How do you get someone on the other end to talk to us? And typically, when someone does talk to us, we have very high conversion rate. Like if we like them and they like us back, the rest of the hiring process, honestly, is like to make sure we were right to begin with on sourcing, right? We would have hired this person on paper, then we would check in to make sure that's actually true, our gut was true. But yeah, just getting someone to talk to you ends up sometimes being a numbers game, right? So we would like find 50 people a day on LinkedIn, put them into this like machine, marketing machine that would like email them. You might get like 5-10% return, right? So which means, and that 50 only maybe like few might respond, right? Most of them might even respond saying, nope, I'm not interested. Keep in mind, like the people that we're targeting have like really good jobs already. They're very good, right? They're GMs at Uber kind of people. So most of them are not gonna want it. So most of it is how do you get creative in being in front of them and getting their attention? It depends on the role, right? Like obviously, if you're in sales, business development, yeah, like that, we are probably testing for that, right? But if you're an engineer, you're not going to value that as much. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say we would like not hire them because they speak well. But if they speak well, it's a good sign. But we have to be conscious of our personal biases in making sure that we ask the right questions to uncover if there are any other problems. We definitely hired people just based on that, and we'll like look back and say like, that was a waste of time. We hired a guy recently. to run. So in Austin, we run like a incubator where we've started a few businesses. He came from like a really impressive company. He was an early employee there, said all the right stuff, but couldn't deliver, right? But then when we dig deeper into what he exactly did he do in that other company, turned out to be not very impressive. We just saw the impressive company, we saw that he was an early employee, and we just got like so excited. I think that's another piece in recruiting that's hard, is that getting super excited about a candidate, right? Like someone, as soon as you have heuristics and you say like, oh man, this guy checks it out, you become like so excited, you don't want to hear anything bad about that person, right? You block it out a little bit. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I don't think it's bad. We want people, because even engineers have to be pitching what we do to other people, so we want people who can communicate well. But so I wouldn't say it's like a negative, it's just making sure that they also have all the positive attributes that we care about. Good point. I mean, that's how I used to think about recruiting a lot. Coming in was mostly around like a process optimization. Okay, it's fine. Like any of these people could be good, right? And then how do you figure out of this pool who could be the best? It's fine. I mean, obviously we've opportunistically hired some of those people as well. Usually that works out better if it takes like less time to do that. So what I mean is, if someone comes through a network and their resume is like not as perfect, then you can ask questions to your common mutual friend about that person, right? You just need someone to champion that person, right? But on the flip side of that, if you say you post something on Indeed, and you get like a ton of, like I posted something on Indeed and like the next day you have like 50 applicants, right? Like just going through those applications itself takes like 2 hours, right? So, and typically you'll go through all of them and you like reject every single one of them. So that's why like sometimes inbound could have that negative correlation with talent. So really, like, the question is, how can you proactively source? Do you have enough proactive sourcing, right? And then there's obviously a part of building a company is that you have to go to war with the team you have, right? So maybe you're not going to find like their early employee at Google working for you, right? That's probably not going to happen. So you're going to have to figure out how to adjust your heuristic based on that, right? So at Piazza, we saw a lot of, we'll hire from these like top schools, but they'll come in with this very like outlandish like asks for things or whatever. They weren't willing to sort of put their head down and just like crush and build a company. So then we adjusted our heuristics to go after like Midwest schools, right? We hired a lot from like CMU, Michigan, Texas. Like we picked schools where people come in with like a healthy attitude towards building something valuable, versus your typical Stanford student who's like constantly trying to figure out what the next like cool app that they can get involved in. So yeah, it is hard, but I would say it's not as hard as what people think it is in sourcing. It takes some time to build a machine that starts yielding. So with our multi-touch email campaign, right? Like, yeah, the first day you start, you're only sending 50 emails, right? And that doesn't seem like much. But then the second day, you have 50 emails that you found, but also the second touch of the 50 emails from the previous day hitting in. So that becomes 100. And as you like go through the week, on Friday, you're essentially sending out 250 emails, which at each stage you can convert at a different level, right? Like the first touch might only convert at like 2-3%. The second step might convert at like 4-5%. And then by the end, you might have converted 10%. But 10% of like, 250 people, it's like a lot of candidates. And this pool is exactly what you want, right? So within a week, you can set up your pipeline with like the best people you want to hire. Now you have more choice in saying, okay, out of these people, who can I afford? Or who is the least like complex? Like I don't know how to move them. Like they're here, they're ready to start tomorrow. Like you can have better choice. But I would say like investing in like sourcing is like incredibly important. Yeah. So yeah. I mean there are two problems. One is they would join and then like the retention was hard, right? There was always some cool thing that they were trying to go after. It was also tough from a recruiting process standpoint, right? You recruit them, but then for them, you're one of like 25 different startups that's claiming they're going to change the world, right? Whereas like not a lot of startups go to Michigan, right? But they still have really smart kids, So how do you target those kids? And using like our platform, it's very easy for us to target a lot of these students. A co-founder. Yeah, so I would say, again, like the process is actually very, very similar, right? The thing that changes is a heuristic, right? Like who is going to be, and then like what does being a co-founder mean to you, right? Like it might be, is it no pay, work all the time, or is it like kind of work on it while I'm in school, or is it seed funded? You know, like there are different stages. Based on that, the heuristic might change, right? If you're in college and you want to take semester off and do that, like who would be the best person for that? Where are you going to find them? You're probably not going to find them, you know, on angel lists, right? You might find them in some entrepreneurship club. Like maybe you might find them in this room, right? Someone who already said, you know, I'm going to go and do this, right? That person's more closely matching your heuristic for a co-founder than someone who's already working at like a big company, right? So I would say the vetting process is mostly the same. Um, I would even say like the sourcing, like getting them to talk to you is probably still the same, but how do you adjust? Who are you looking for? And then like the strategies or the ideas that come and finding them might change a little bit. Right.